The automatic doors parted with a sigh and gave Danielle Carter a quiet welcome that no one else offered. Cool air rolled over her skin, the manufactured chill that kept Gemstones comfortable and customers alert. The store lights were calibrated to a clean daylight tone that made every facet look like morning. Rows of glass cases seemed to breathe with their own steady pulse, the shimmer of diamonds and moissanite winking in gentle rhythm. Somewhere near the back, a soft jazz track threaded itself through the silence, polite and inoffensive, the kind of music that suggested sophistication without daring to ask for attention. Danielle paused just inside, taking the first second for herself, for the thought she never said aloud. This space exists because I imagine it and refuse to let it stay imaginary. She had chosen jeans, white sneakers, and a black blazer that sat on her shoulders like a line drawn with purpose. Her hair was pulled back cleanly, a light gloss caught at her bottom lip. No entourage, no name badge, no announcement to the staff channel. She wanted a candid look at the life of the place, an honest reading of its pulse. She had not visited this branch in many months, and that distance was deliberate. A flagship had to be more than a stage. It had to be a promise that kept renewing itself even when the founder was not in the wings prompting the cues. Past the entry, a pedestal featured the radiant signature motif, a delicate starburst rendered in white gold, small enough to sit at the base of the throat and large enough to catch a breath from across a room. A couple stood shoulder to shoulder, speaking in those soft tones people borrow for sacred spaces. A sales associate nodded as they talked, pen angled over a velvet pad, patient, attentive. The scene eased Danielle's shoulders down a fraction. She had fought to teach that patience, to make it company culture rather than personal favor. People came here to be seen at their best. The worst thing a store could do was rush them back to ordinary. She slipped along the main aisle, the rubber in her soles catching the faintest friction on spotless tile. Every dozen steps, a discreet sensor woke a new bank of lights inside a case, as if the jury understood when a human eye had arrived. The scent of fresh lilies mixed with a whisper of glass cleaner, both familiar signatures of an opening checklist done with care. Danielle tracked details the way another person might track birds. The spacing of stands inside each case, the angle of neck forms, the neatness of the microfiber cloth folded inside the drawer lip, the presence or absence of fingerprints on the stainless trim. So far, the store looked like a photo that had learned how to breathe. At the far left bay, a display caught her attention not because it was wrong, but because it was new. The header card read, in a tidy serif, Solstice, Limited Capsule. Danielle stopped. She had not approved anything by that name. The necklace at center was a crescent of yellow gold, pinpricked with paved stones that curved into a near circle, almost closed but not quite, the gap suggesting both a breath and a choice. It was, she had to admit, beautiful. Beauty alone, though, had never been her only standard. A release name carried a story carried a promise had to be real. She leaned closer, reading the tiny plaque that listed materials and price. Someone had written a line beneath the specs. Every day deserves a little ceremony. Clever, on brand, and also unfamiliar. She glanced up, searching for the team member who owned this case, the way she could once glance at a font choice and know which designer on staff had picked it. On the right, a young associate in a soft gray suit adjusted an earring stand for a guest and did not see her. On the left, a cashier tied a repair order and did not look up. Behind the custom desk, the bench jeweler bent over a loop, shoulders like a parent hovering over a newborn. Danielle smiled despite herself. Unnoticed could be a blessing when the work was being done well. She let her fingertips hover over glass, never touching, the restraint almost ceremonial. She considered the stones, the symmetry, the clasp. The clasp was a small triumph, a secure latch disguised as a kiss of metal. That detail felt like radiance. The boldness of a capsule launch without her signature felt like another kind of boldness. A useful one, maybe, or a reckless one. She cataloged the thought without pinning it to a conclusion. The point of coming unannounced was to listen before she judged. Through the reflection, she caught her own face and, for an instant, a carousel of memory. The first trunk show where she had sold 3 pieces and pretended she was calm while her heart attempted to drum straight through her ribs. The late night spent at a dining table turned drafting station, tracing curves until the paper wore thin. The contract she read 4 times over to be certain the lease would not sink her before she sailed. Radiance had grown, because she never let survival look like an accident. She had learned to read the air, the pause, the way a customer's eyes flickered between longing and fear. She trusted that reading now. Something in the air was off by a hair, nothing dramatic, more like a painting hung 1 notch too low. A young boy pressed his nose to a lowercase and left a foggy oval. His mother apologized, and the nearby associate laughed softly, offering a square cloth without a trace of scolding. Danielle watched the mother's shoulders release their stiffness. Yes, she thought, that is the tone. Leave people better than you found them. She took 1 step closer to the solstice display, then another, angling for the perfect vantage where reflection did not fracture the view. The crescent seemed to float, a small moon trapped inside the clear nighted case. She imagined the copy she might write if she blessed a line, a piece that honors a moment between almost and yes, the bright line where a day becomes an occasion. The idea thrilled her with its neatness. It also pricked her pride to know she had not been asked. She pictured the calendar in her head, the product council meetings, the chain of approvals that protected the brand from drifting into pastiche. Had a meeting been rescheduled? Had a memo been sent while she was on a plane to Los Angeles, while she was pitching the partnership that could double their footprint? She did not resent autonomy. She had hired for it. She simply expected it to be honest. She breathed in, let the worry ride out on a longer breath, and leaned just enough to read the bottom line of the card again. Limited. Capsule. Words that could either mean discipline, scarcity, or clever cover for inventory that did not pass muster. A sliver of amusement crossed her face. The store had surprised her. Good. She wanted truth, not theater. She adjusted her blazer cuff, turned her head to call for assistance, and waited for a voice to meet her halfway. No one came right away. That, too, told her something. She decided she would introduce herself only after she saw how the room treated a stranger who looked like her, walked like her, and asked questions with care. She stopped waiting for a welcome and, with quiet curiosity, prepared to make the first move. Danielle shifted her weight slightly, still standing near the solstice display, when the sound of measured, firm footsteps came from the far end of the showroom. The rhythm was decisive, the kind that announced authority before the man even appeared. From the corner of her eye, she saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, wearing a navy suit with a tie patterned in muted stripes. His hair was neatly combed back, the sides showing a controlled dusting of gray that seemed more intentional than inevitable. He moved like someone who had rehearsed the role of manager for years, each step carrying an air of possession over the space. By the time he reached her, his expression had already formed a kind of polite smile that did not quite reach the eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, but the cadence and the slight tilt of his head made the sentence sound more like, "What exactly are you doing here?" His eyes ran a quick scan over her blazer, jeans, and sneakers, lingering a beat too long on the shoes before returning to her face. Danielle responded with a small nod, her tone warm but controlled. "I'm just looking," she said, glancing briefly at the necklace again. She kept her voice even, the kind of reply any regular customer might give. He didn't step closer to assist her. Instead, his gaze darted toward the couple at the pedestal, then back to her, as though weighing the contrast. "These are some of our higher-end pieces," he said, gesturing vaguely at the display cases around them. His voice was still outwardly polite, but a subtle undercurrent had crept in, something cautionary, almost guarding. Danielle let the silence hang for a moment before answering. "I notice you have some new designs," she said, nodding toward the solstice necklace. "This one caught my eye." He stepped into her line of sight, effectively blocking her view of the necklace. "That's part of a special line we've been carrying," he said, his shoulders squaring slightly. "It's a bit exclusive. We generally show those to clients who booked a private appointment." The words were measured, but the implication was sharp enough to cut. Her brow lifted just slightly, but she didn't challenge him. "Is that policy?" she asked. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "It's not so much policy as it is understanding our clientele. We try to make sure everyone's time is well spent." The phrasing was smooth, But Danielle caught the almost imperceptible glance at her sneakers again. She shifted her stance, planting her feet evenly. "I see," she said, her tone light, but with an edge of something firmer beneath. The manager gave a quick, almost dismissive smile, as if to smooth over the moment. "We've had a lot of interest from our regulars," he continued. "They appreciate a certain environment here." That word, environment, landed with a weight that told her it was doing more work than it seemed. She recognized the language of exclusion when she heard it. Still, she chose not to confront it directly. Not yet. She wanted to see how far he would go without being challenged. "Environment matters," Danielle agreed, her voice low but steady. "It tells people whether they belong." Something in her phrasing made him pause, a faint crease forming between his brows. But he recovered quickly, stepping slightly to the side while still keeping himself positioned as a gate between her and the display. "If you're looking for something within a different range," he began, "we have some lovely pieces toward the front of the store. More approachable price points. Same radiance quality, of course." His smile returned, but it was thinner now, stretched just enough to meet the requirements of courtesy. Danielle considered him for a moment, then took a slow step to her right, as if she might follow his gesture. Instead, she stopped halfway and let her eyes travel deliberately back to the necklace. "I'd still like to learn more about this one," she said. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "It might not be the best fit," he replied, and this time the softness in his tone had worn away. There was no explicit refusal, but the conversation was taking a shape that left very little room for her to remain on equal footing. In that moment, she noticed a subtle shift in the air. A nearby associate glanced over, but quickly looked away when the manager caught her eye. A small exchange, but it told Danielle volumes about the dynamics in this store. The man adjusted his tie, a gesture more about control than comfort. "If you like, I can point you toward some options that align better with what you might be looking for." The deliberate vagueness of what you might be looking for was another quiet wall being built between them. Danielle let her gaze rest on him for a heartbeat longer before answering. "I think I know how to decide that for myself," she said softly, the edges of the words perfectly smooth. He didn't smile this time. Instead, he gave a small, tight nod, the kind reserved for situations where the conversation was not going as planned, but one had to maintain the appearance of composure. A silence stretched, the kind that made the soft jazz in the background suddenly more audible. Somewhere, a customer laughed quietly at something an associate said, and the normal rhythm of the store continued around them. Except here, in this small circle of floor space, the air was noticeably heavier. The manager took a half step back, as if reconsidering his approach, but instead of opening the space for her to move forward, he angled his body just enough to keep his presence dominant. "If you change your mind about what you're after, I'll be right here," he said, his voice holding a finality that suggested he expected this to be the end of the interaction. Danielle did not respond immediately. She let the pause grow, not out of indecision, but out of a calculated patience. She wasn't done, but she also knew that the next move wasn't hers to rush. Greg's eyes did a small, involuntary inventory of Danielle again, like a scanner attempting to sort a mismatched item. His smile reappeared, but now it felt like a mask that had been tightened one notch too far. "If you are just browsing," he said, lowering his voice to something syrupy, "you might be happier near the entrance. We keep pieces there that are more spontaneous, fun purchases." He made the word fun sound like flimsy. Without waiting for an answer, he angled his body so that his arm created a corridor back toward the front of the store, a gesture that dressed itself as guidance but moved like a boundary. Danielle did not budge. Her tone remained almost conversational. "I prefer to see the full range before I decide," she said. "Could you tell me who designed this capsule?" She kept her gaze on the necklace rather than on him, granting the product a respect he conspicuously withheld. He cleared his throat. "Our team collaborated with consultant," he replied, vague to the point of useless. "It is a higher bracket. The clients we show it to are very particular, and we do not want to waste their time or yours." A couple near the pedestal drifted closer, drawn by the familiar gravity of conversation that might be interesting. An associate halfway down the aisle watched with the skittish attention of someone who knew which way the current usually flowed. Danielle felt the attention gather and chose her words with care. "I do not find information wasteful," she said evenly. "A product in view should be a product one can discuss." Greg's smile tightened further. "Of course," he said, but the words were lacquer over with that already warped. "Still, we avoid putting very delicate merchandise into high-touch situations unless we are confident about the fit. You understand?" She heard the subtext as clearly as if he had printed it on a placard. Fit. The word worked extra hours in places like this, pulling in class, race, and 100 little judgments that hid inside one syllable. She let the silence answer for her a moment, then said, "Would you mind unlocking the case so I can see the clasp up close? If it is a limited piece, I would like to evaluate the finishing." He did not move. "We can schedule a private appointment," he offered, voice bright with false generosity. "A consultant could walk you through options that align with a realistic plan. Sometimes people get excited and need help translating inspiration into something attainable. There is no shame in that." He added a small, rehearsed laugh that asked everyone listening to agree the world was full of charming, unrealistic browsers. A small muscle in Danielle's jaw ticked once. She kept her hands relaxed at her sides. "You are assuming I need to scale down," she said, almost gentle. "Why?" For the first time, he abandoned performance of warmth. "Experience," he replied. "We can usually tell who is ready for a piece at this level." It avoids awkward moments at checkout. His glance flicked to her sneakers one more time, a tell that had turned into a habit. Danielle felt the temperature in her chest shift a fraction. She would not let it flare. "Understood," she said. "Then let's avoid an awkward moment and focus on facts. What is the stone weight on the crescent? Who supplied the melee? Which bench finalized the clasp? If it is a consultant's line, there should be documentation." His brows rose as if she had spoken a language he did not expect her to know. The associate down the aisle stiffened, recognizing the terms. Greg recovered with a shrug that attempted to reduce her knowledge to trivia. "Those details are internal," he said, "and frankly not necessary at this stage." "At what stage would knowledge be necessary?" Danielle asked. "After someone proves they belong?" The couple who had been listening pretended to examine a nearby bracelet, but their ears had not left the scene. One of the sales associates straightened a tray of rings that did not need straightening. Greg's tone cooled. "We pride ourselves on discretion," he said. "Part of discretion is protecting premium merchandise from casual handling. If you have questions about financing, our team can help. Many customers find plans that feel comfortable." "Financing," Danielle repeated, the word soft, as if she were turning it over in her palm. "You have not asked my name, and yet you have a plan for my comfort." He crossed his arms in a careful, managerial way that signaled authority without overt threat. "Names are taken at the desk," he said. "We are simply trying to guide you toward a better match. Some items are aspirational. That is their role." "Jewelry does not have a role," she said, still calm. "People give it one." He let out a breath, impatient now. "Look," he said, lowering his voice as if he were rescuing her from embarrassment. "We have guests who expect a certain experience. When others linger too long in areas that are not meant for them, it changes the atmosphere. We cannot have that." The phrase "not meant for them" hung in the air like a misfired alarm. Danielle felt the room tilt, not dramatically, but enough that everyone standing nearby recalibrated their stance. She thought of the promise she had built into this brand, the one stitched into training materials and onboarding scripts, the one she believed could outlast any one person's bias if the culture was tended. She met his gaze. "Then we disagree about what the space is," she said. "I came here to be a customer. I have asked you to do the basics of your job." He tipped his chin toward the entrance again. "The basics of my job include protecting inventory and experience," he said. "If you would like to see pieces that are appropriate, I can show you something charming in sterling." A young woman near the custom desk winced. The bench jeweler glanced up, caught Danielle's expression, and looked away quickly, as if contact might implicate him. Danielle's voice thinned to a single steel wire. "No," she said. "I asked for this case. Unlock it." Greg did not move. Instead, he smiled, the kind that resealed the conversation and announced its end. "Ma'am," he said, "I am trying to save you disappointment. This line is reserved for serious buyers. If you insist, we can proceed to a credit pre-check before we remove anything from the case. It streamlines things for everyone." The disrespect landed cleanly now, no longer disguised as guidance. Danielle felt the heat crawl up her spine and settle at the base of her neck. Even then, she kept her voice composed. "A credit pre-check before a product demonstration," she said. "That is your policy?" "It is how we avoid misunderstandings," he replied. "People sometimes do not realize how high these numbers go. I would hate for you to feel uncomfortable." He said uncomfortable as if he were offering her mercy. She let the words sink into the floor rather than into her. "You have made a set of assumptions," she said. "You can own them. I will not carry them for you." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a card holder, not to hand him anything, not yet, but to remind herself that she had chosen restraint, not silence. She slid the holder back into place. "One more time," she said, "each syllable measure with care. Open the case." Greg took a long second, deciding whether to escalate or retreat. He chose the path he believed the room would endorse. "I am going to decline," he said, voice crisp with finality. "For now, I need you to look in the front section if you wish to continue browsing. We maintain standards. That is why our regulars trust us." Danielle did not step back. "Trust is not built by shrinking other people," she said. "You are obstructing," he replied, "and you are drawing attention we do not want. Please move along." The words planted themselves like stakes. Around them, the air thinned to the sound of the music and the faint buzz of the track lighting. Danielle could feel the choice arrive, clear as a bell. Continue the quiet experiment or end it. She lowered her voice 1 degree further, offering him a final exit he refused to see. "You can correct this," she said, "or you can own it when you cannot." He stared back, unblinking, convinced he was a custodian of a standard. She held his gaze and deliberately let the moment pass into a silence that marked the last of her patience. Greg's stance hardened, his feet set slightly wider as if anchoring himself in place. He gave a perfunctory glance toward the front of the store, where 2 women were now browsing near the display of bracelets. Their conversation faltered, attention tilting in Danielle's direction, but they quickly turned back to jewelry, as if trying to keep their interest unnoticed. Greg, however, caught the shift and used it. "You're starting to make the other guests uncomfortable," he said, lowering his voice only enough that it carried the tone of a private warning, though it was still audible to anyone who cared to listen. "We like to keep the atmosphere here easy and pleasant. This isn't that." Danielle studied him for a long beat, her expression unreadable. She could feel the subtle pressure of eyes on her from various points in the store, some curious, some wary, and 1 or 2 openly assessing the situation like they were watching a chess game they didn't know the rules to. "I asked to see your new product line," she said evenly. "That's all." "You've asked," he said quickly, "and I've explained our approach. It's my responsibility to manage who interacts with certain pieces. That's not personal, it's professional." He added that last word with a kind of finality, as though it were a shield that made his choices immune to scrutiny. But Danielle caught the flicker in his eyes, the slight tightening at the corners that betrayed a stubborn confidence in his assumptions. She glanced past him at the solstice necklace again, the display glass now reflecting both of their faces side by side, her calm composure against his guarded rigidity. "I'm not disrupting anything," she said, her tone still soft, but it landed with more weight now. "That's not how it looks from where I stand," Greg replied. He stepped closer, his shoulder almost brushing hers as he subtly angled his body to direct her toward the main aisle. The move was calculated, a physical suggestion layered over a verbal one. Danielle remained in place, her voice steady. "Your approach is closing the door before I've even walked through it." Greg sighed through his nose, the sound clipped and irritated. "Look, I've been doing this for a long time. I can usually tell when someone is here to buy, and when they're here to browse for the sake of it. This section is for serious buyers. It's not a gallery." The casual dismissal threaded through his words like a fine wire, sharp enough to cut without leaving a visible wound. Danielle let the silence between them stretch again, but this time Greg didn't wait it out. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave this area," he said louder now. His voice carried across the room, enough for the two women by the bracelets to pause and glance up again. One of the sales associates near the register shifted uncomfortably, glancing from Danielle to Greg, but saying nothing. The bench jeweler had gone completely still, his hands frozen above the ring he'd been adjusting, eyes fixed on his work in an effort not to see. "On what grounds?" Danielle asked, not raising her voice but making sure her words were clear. "On the grounds that I am responsible for this store," Greg said, "and I am telling you this section is closed to you unless you have an appointment or an established account. It's our way of protecting our clients and our merchandise. I can escort you to the front to see pieces more suited to your visit." The firmness in his tone was designed to sound like policy rather than preference, but Danielle recognized the difference. She kept her gaze locked on him, not in defiance but in quiet appraisal. "You believe you're protecting your store by shutting someone out," she said. "I believe I'm keeping the experience for everyone as it should be," he countered. "If I make exceptions, the entire environment changes. It's my job to set that line." "And who decided where that line is?" she asked. Greg straightened his posture, chin slightly lifted. "I did," he said simply. For a moment, the hum of the store filled the space between them. The faint music, the low murmur of the other customers, the gentle whir of the air system. Danielle took in the scene, noting how quickly the invisible boundaries of power in the room had shifted. "I think we're finished here," Greg added, his voice now carrying the unmistakable cadence of an order. "Please head to the front, or I'll have to ask you to leave entirely." Her eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained controlled. "You've already made that decision, haven't you?" His lips pressed into a line. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'm not here to debate. I'm here to maintain standards." Danielle glanced toward the door for the first time since he approached her. She could feel the attention of the staff who had been silent, the customers pretending not to watch. The choice before her was clear: stay and continue the exchange or walk away on her own terms. She drew a slow breath, letting the air settle her. "Then I won't take more of your time," she said, her words carefully even. Greg stepped aside with a small, deliberate movement, the kind that said he had won the encounter. He didn't look at her as she began to walk toward the entrance. The two women near the bracelet shifted subtly as Danielle passed, one of them giving a small, almost imperceptible shake of the head, as though silently acknowledging what they'd witnessed. Near the register, the associate who had looked uncomfortable earlier followed Danielle with her eyes until she reached the doors. Danielle didn't rush. Each step toward the exit was measured, unhurried, her posture upright, her gaze forward. The softness of the door's opening greeted her, and the warm air outside wrapped around her shoulders like a sharp contrast to the cooled, curated atmosphere she'd just left behind. She paused just beyond the threshold, the store's front glass reflecting a slightly distorted image of herself against the backdrop of the showroom. Inside, she could still see Greg standing near the solstice display, already turning his attention back to the couple who had begun to drift his way. Danielle reached into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing against the smooth edge of her phone. She pulled it out and unlocked the screen in one motion, her reflection still caught faintly in the glass beside her. She had made her choice, and it wouldn't end here. The door sensor breathed another soft hush behind her as the glass slid back into place, sealing the conditioned air inside. For a heartbeat, Danielle stood with one hand loosely at her side, the other holding her phone like a quiet intention. The sidewalk heat pressed up on the concrete, a shimmer that blurred the edges of passing cars. She registered the echo of music dimly, the store's curated soundtrack, reduced to a distant thread. She could have walked away and let time file the sting down to a dull memory. Instead, a voice split the seal between inside and out. "Ma'am," Greg called, the word sharp and performative, carrying farther than needed. The door had not fully settled before he stepped into the vestibule, not crossing the threshold, but looming just past it, framed by brass and glass, as if the building itself endorsed what came next. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises now." Heads turned inside. The two women by the bracelets went still. At the custom desk, a man who had been filling out a repair ticket angled his body so his ear, not his eyes, faced the door. The associate at the register pressed her lips together and looked down, the receipt printer slipping out a pale ribbon that she did not tear. The words "leave the premises" were chosen with care, the kind of phrasing that added weight and implied authority, as if Danielle were lingering where she had no right to be. She did not step closer. She did not step back. The sidewalk belonged to the city, and the space directly in front of the store belonged to the narrative Greg was trying to write. Danielle simply turned her head enough to meet his eyes through the glass. Her reflection overlay his face for a sliver of a second, a ghosted double exposure in which her calm stare floated over his tightened jaw. "I am outside," she said, voice level, not loud. She did not raise her phone. Not yet. She let the sentence land with the subtlety of correction given in a boardroom. Precise, unembellished, undeniable. Greg glanced beyond her as if searching for a security camera that could later justify his tone. "Then please move along," he replied. "We do not allow loitering near the entrance. It discourages our buyers." Discourages our buyers clung to the glass like fog. The door hissed again as a young couple exited, and they had to pivot sideways to slip around his body. The woman murmured a quick, "Excuse me," polite and confused. Greg gave them a tight nod, then recentered himself, ensuring his posture read as custodial rather than confrontational. Danielle let the second pass through her. She had trained executive teams to keep their cadence when provoked. She summoned the same muscle memory now. "You have made yourself clear," she said. "You can go back to your guests." The word "guests" pressed with the gentlest irony. Color rose one shade along his cheekbones. He was not used to dismissals that did not come with apology. Inside the store, a teenager in a denim jacket stood near the pedestal and half lifted his phone, not obviously recording, but testing the idea of it. His mother touched his wrist and lowered the device, her eyes warning him not to make a spectacle. The bench jeweler had abandoned the loop and was staring at a fixed point on the counter, as his stillness might render him invisible. Greg exhaled through his nose, the breath clouding the line between irritation and certainty. "We reserve the right to refuse service," he announced, straightening the lapels of his navy jacket with a practiced tug. The statement was addressed to Danielle, but pitched toward the customers inside, a performance of policy erected after the act. "And we do so when behavior suggests a mismatch with our standards." The word "mismatch" slid into place like a tile that completed a mosaic no one had asked to see. Danielle did not answer. She did not owe the moment her defense. A delivery truck rumbled past, sunlight glinting off its side. From somewhere down the street came the clap of a crosswalk sign resetting. The everyday city went on, indifferent to one man's attempt to turn a doorway into a dais. A child tugged on her father's sleeve and pointed at the necklace in the window, the starburst motif catching a flare of noon light. Danielle followed the child's gaze for an instant, then returned to Greg. His shoulders had squared further, as if feedback gathered invisibly in his bones and hardened them. It struck her then how much safety he drew from the frame of that door. Without it, his authority might have felt less like a rule and more like an opinion. With it, he could pretend he was policy incarnate. "Move along, please," he repeated. And this time there was a thin impatience in his timbre that made several customers flinch in solidarity for someone they did not know. A car slowed, the driver glancing toward the tableau with the harmless curiosity of a passerby. Danielle could feel the moment tipping toward the spectacle Greg wanted. She would not give it to him. She inclined her head once, not in concession, but in a gesture that closed the scene she did not write. She lifted her phone only enough to wake the screen. The reflection showed her face for a breath, then gave way to a list of names that formed the spine of her company. Inside the store, the associate at the register tore the receipt at last, the small rip sounding loud. Her eyes flicked up. They met Danielle's through the glass, then fell again. A man near the watch case muttered his partner, a single phrase too soft to catch, the syllables trailing like smoke. Greg glanced over his shoulder, verifying that the room was still his. Satisfied, he added one more sentence, the final flourish of someone who could not resist clarifying his opinion as doctrine. "Radiance is for serious buyers," he said. It's not a place to browse dreams. The cruelty of it was not its volume, but its poise. He had dressed the insult in company language, the way someone might slip a blade into a well-cut pocket. Danielle felt the words meet her skin and slide off. Refused entry by the long practice of not letting strangers rearrange her. She did not feed the line with rebuttal. She looked at him without heat and without permission. Silence can be the kindest scalpel. It separates what matters from what is simply loud. The door breathed again as an elderly man eased his way out, a small box in his hand tied with navy ribbon. He paused, as if sensing the edge in the air, then nodded to Danielle with the mild courtesy of his generation. She nodded back. The exchange was tiny and human, and entirely outside Greg's script. Danielle lowered her eyes to her phone. Her thumb hovered briefly over a notes app, then dismissed it. This moment did not require eloquence captured in text. It required clarity executed in sequence. She swiped to contacts and scrolled. Names flicked past. Design lead, merchandising, human resources director. She stopped at the one she needed. She did not press call yet. First, she inhaled through her nose, long enough to feel the breath stretch the line of her spine, then release. She did not want anger to color the report. Precision would do the work better than heat. Behind the glass, a young sales associate broke ranks. She took 2 steps toward the front, as if to speak, then stopped when Greg's head turned a fraction. The pause cut her courage in half. She pivoted smoothly and pretended to straighten a tray of studs, though every earring already faced the same clean direction. The tiny betrayal of self stung Danielle in a way Greg's words had not. Culture failures did not just bruise customers. They hollowed employees. The sun shifted, nudging the store's reflection higher on the glass. Danielle caught another ghosted overlap of her face and the solstice display beyond, the almost circle necklace catching a glimmer like a hell breath. The copy line on the placard, barely legible at this angle, seemed to lift for one instant. Every day deserves a little ceremony. The sentence landed differently now. Ceremony was not always champagne and velvet. Sometimes it was the quiet dignity of naming a harm and setting about to repair it. A pair of friends approached the entrance with shopping bags from a boutique down the block. They slowed at the sight of Greg planted in the vestibule, looked from him to Danielle, then back again. One of them blinked as recognition clicked. Danielle could see the moment the woman tried to place her face, the way people who follow business pages sometimes do. It was not the time to test familiarity in public. Danielle offered neutral, closed-mouthed smile that said, "Not now." The woman understood. She gave a tiny nod, then slipped past Greg, who stepped aside with performative courtesy, and the friends disappeared into the showroom's cool light. "Final notice," Greg said, as if she had asked for a countdown. "Please clear the entrance." Danielle let the phrase dissolve. She took 2 unhurried steps to her right, enough to place herself under the awning of the neighboring storefront shade, her body no longer a silhouette directly against Radiance's door. The update satisfied nothing in him. It was never about inches of sidewalk. Still, the adjustment freed the entrance for customers, the practical courtesy she would have extended even without the provocation. She checked the time on her phone. Seconds mattered now. Not because she was impatient, but because speed is another form of respect when harm has been done. A city bus exhaled at a corner stop. A bicyclist rang a small bell as he threaded between cars. The world recommitted to its rhythm. Danielle allowed herself one interior question. How many tiny moments like this had gone unreported because the person on the receiving end had not had the power to name them to someone who would listen? The thought lifted and settled, not as guilt, but as a responsibility inventory she would expand later. Right now, this branch, this door, this manager. She opened the contact card and saw the number she needed, the one routed to a district supervisor who had built his reputation not on speed alone, but on showing up where the temperature was rising. Her thumb hovered for a last fraction that looked like poise and felt like mercy. She was about to pull a thread that would unravel a certain performance of authority in front of a room full of witnesses. The consequence was deserved. It would also send a message to the staff that she hoped landed as safety, not spectacle. Inside, The young associate who had hesitated a moment earlier stepped to the register and said something quietly to the cashier. The cashier's mouth softened in what might have been agreement or sorrow. The bench jeweler finally set down his tools and rolled his shoulders like someone waking from a bad dream. Greg, sensing his audience dispersing back into their consumer choreography, adjusted his tie again, settled his suit jacket across his midsection, and retreated 2 steps into the vestibule. He looked at Danielle as if to say, "There, that is done." She let him have the illusion for another heartbeat. Let him write the last line of his own version of the scene. The true record would begin in a different register. She tapped the screen. The contact card opened to options. She selected the one that would ring through without delay. As the first tone prepared to leap across the air, Danielle tipped her chin, centered herself under the thin strip of shade, and let her expression settle into something calm and exacting, the look she wore when she was about to reorder a room. The ringing cut clean through the ambient street noise, each tone distinct against the muted rush of passing traffic. Danielle held the phone close, not pressed to her ear yet, as if she were letting the rhythm settle into the space before she committed to speaking. On the third ring, a voice answered, warm in timbre, but sharpened by the kind of attentiveness that comes from handling problems before they ignite. "Danielle." The district supervisor's tone carried both surprise and the instinctive alertness of someone who rarely received direct calls from the founder during midday hours. Her reply was even, each word clipped with purpose. "I just got kicked out of my own store." There was no immediate answer. She could hear the faint, static-wrapped hum of his car engine, the subtle click of a turn signal in the background. The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was the brief pause of someone replaying the sentence to ensure they'd heard it correctly. "You're at Peachtree?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, pitched for discretion even though there was no one else on the line. "Yes," she said, standing outside. "The manager made it clear I wasn't welcome. He called it protecting the environment." On the other end, there was the sound of a blinker stopping, then a door closing. Fast. The kind of fast that said the call had reordered the priorities instantly. "Stay there. Do not leave," he said. "I'm 3 minutes away. I was at Lenox. Just wrapped up a visit. I'm coming now." She did not thank him. Gratitude wasn't the point. Accuracy was. "I'll be right here," she replied, and ended the call without ceremony. She slid the phone back into her blazer pocket and let her hand rest there, fingers curled loosely around the smooth fabric lining. The decision had been made. The course was already set. She would not pace, not signal impatience. Instead, she stood beneath the narrow stretch of shade, watching the flow of people passing along the sidewalk, letting her breathing match the unhurried tempo of their movement. Inside the store, Greg had retreated fully back to the display area, his posture now turned outward toward customers, but his eyes still flicked once toward the entrance every few moments. Danielle noted the behavior the way she might note the position of a chess piece before the next turn. Not to judge in a moment, but to remember for later analysis. The minutes were long enough for her to observe the fine-grained differences in the foot traffic, the way lunch-hour shoppers carry themselves compared to the purposeful stride of someone on an errand. The muted scent of coffee drifted from the cafe 2 doors down, mixing faintly with the perfume cloud trailing a woman in a deep blue dress as she passed. From down the block came the sound of an engine accelerating, the kind of steady, restrained speed that marked someone both determined and in control. Danielle glanced toward the intersection just as a dark sedan eased into the parking lane in front of the store. The district supervisor, Marcus Hale, stepped out in one motion, locking the car with a flick of his thumb. He was tall, with the kind of athletic bearing that came from years of discipline rather than casual gym visits, and his suit was tailored in a way that made movement look deliberate. His eyes found hers immediately. He didn't hurry. Haste was its own kind of broadcast, but his stride had the clipped decisiveness of a man moving straight to the point. As he reached her, his expression was calm on the surface, but his gaze carried a heat that was not for her. "Inside?" he asked. "Inside," she confirmed, her voice low. "He doesn't know who I am." Marcus gave the faintest nod, a single downward tilt of the chin that said he had already mapped out the first steps in his mind. He opened the door for her without looking back at Greg, holding it just long enough for her to walk through beside him. The store's climate-controlled air wrapped around them instantly, a sharp contrast to the street heat. Conversations dipped in volume as the customers registered their arrival. Danielle kept her posture neutral, her eyes forward, scanning without scanning, allowing Marcus to set the pace. Greg was mid-sentence with a middle-aged man examining a watch when he noticed Marcus. His words faltered for half a beat, then resumed, but his eyes didn't leave the supervisor's face. When they slid past Marcus to land on Danielle, a subtle tightening occurred at the corners of his mouth, a reflex, unguarded. He knew this was not the return he had anticipated. Marcus stopped in front of the display area, his body angled so that he and Greg were square to each other. Danielle stood just slightly to his right, the arrangement unspoken but intentional. It put her in the frame without her having to insert herself. It also placed her in Greg's direct line of sight. The silence that followed was its own statement. Customers lingered at the edges of the scene, pretended browse but leaning ever so slightly closer. The young associate who had hesitated earlier now stood behind the register, her hands resting on the counter, eyes trained forward in a way that made her interest obvious. Greg's greeting came a moment too late to feel natural. "Marcus," he said, aiming for easy professionalism, "I wasn't expecting you today." "You weren't," Marcus agreed. His voice was even, but there was no softness in it. "I happened to be nearby when I got a call. We need to address something immediately." Greg's eyes flicked to Danielle again, then back to Marcus. "Of course," he said. "Is there an issue with the floor?" His tone carried a faint defensiveness, the kind used to preempt criticism before it was voiced. Marcus didn't answer that question. Instead, he stepped slightly to the side and extended a hand toward Danielle, as though he were formally introducing someone at a board meeting. "Greg," he said, "I'd like you to meet Ms. Danielle Carter, founder and CEO of Radiance & Company." The weight of the words hit the space between them like a shift in atmospheric pressure. Greg's expression stilled, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, then closing again without sound. Color drained slowly from his face, leaving him paler beneath the carefully managed tan. The middle-aged man at the watch case froze in place, his hand still hovering over the display glass. Danielle offered her hand across the small gulf of air. The gesture was deliberate, unhurried, and carried none of the sharpness she could have wielded. It was a test wrapped as a courtesy. Greg looked at it, his throat working once in a dry swallow. He didn't take it. The refusal was quiet, but it carried its own volume, and the customers in the near half of the store registered it instantly. Danielle let her hand fall back to her side, the motion fluid, without visible offense. The air in the room had changed. What had started outside as a controlled confrontation was now an audience-held silence, the kind that amplified every next move. Marcus's expression didn't shift. He simply regarded Greg, waiting for the next inevitable sentence, the one that would reveal more than Greg meant it to. The refusal to take Danielle's hand hung in the air like a thin crack running the length of a crystal pane. No one moved, but the room adjusted around the fracture. Marcus did not look away from Greg. His pause was measured, not theatrical, the kind of stillness that makes people lean forward to listen because they sense what comes next will matter. When he finally spoke, his voice stayed even, but the cadence was brisk, as if compressing an entire process into a few clean steps. "Thank you," Marcus said, tipping his head a fraction toward Danielle, acknowledging her presence not as a surprise but as a point. Then to Greg, "We are going to reset the floor. Right now." He turned slightly, catching the eye of the young associate behind the register. "Jenna, please secure the Solstice case. New protocol. Keys stay at the custom counter until further notice." Jenna blinked once, startled to be addressed by name in front of the room, and then moved. The relief in her motion was palpable, like someone being handed a map out of a fog. She retrieved the keys from the small hidden hook under the case lip, locked the panel with a soft click, and crossed to the custom counter, setting them gently beside the velvet-lined trays. The sound of metal on wood was barely audible, yet it seemed to mark the room with a new tempo. Marcus shifted again, efficient, his attention slicing the space into priorities. "Luis," he said toward the bench, "please step away from the tools for a moment." The bench jeweler straightened, hands lifting instinctively, palms bare, the universal sign of pause. Thank you. Nothing leaves or enters cases until I say so. Greg found his voice at last, grasping for authority, the way a person grabs at a railing on a moving train. Marcus, I had it handled, he said, the words coming out tight. We have a way we do things here. I was protecting the brand. Marcus finished for him, not unkindly, but without agreement. Exactly. That is what we're doing now. He did not raise his volume. He did not need to. A few customers, recognizing that this was not ordinary retail theater, edged back to give the conversation more air. A woman in a navy dress rested a hand on her partner's forearm, a shared signal to wait. Danielle stood one pace to Marcus's right, expression calm, posture composed. She did not speak. Her silence was not absence. It was witness. The difference registered on the faces of staff, who watched the geometry of power in the room redraw itself with each small instruction Marcus gave. Jenna, Marcus continued, please print incident forms. Place them under the counter for now. He turned to a second associate near the bracelets, a man with careful posture and nervous eyes. Darren, you will greet every customer who has paused because of this disruption. Apologize for the interruption. Offer water. Let them know we will be fully available in a few minutes. Darren nodded quickly, grateful for something he could do that was not guessing. He moved with genuine care, approaching the couple at the watches first. We appreciate your patience, he said softly, and the customer's shoulders lowered a fraction. Greg took a breath, squaring himself. You are making a scene, he said, keeping his voice low but edged. We cultivate discretion here. This could have been handled in the back. It will be, Marcus said, but not until the room is safe. He let the word safe sit for a moment, letting every person within earshot hear that safety meant more than locks and alarm codes. He turned slightly to include Danielle in his field of view. Ms. Carter, you may walk where you wish. If at any point you prefer privacy, we will make it. Her answer was a small nod. I am fine, she said, voice steady. Carry on. The phrase landed with a kind of quiet authority that folded neatly into Marcus's. He pivoted back to Greg. Please step to the custom counter, he said. Bring your keys. Greg did not move. The streak of defiance that had masqueraded as professionalism all morning surfaced in a tight smile. My keys stay with management, he said. Policy. Management is present, Marcus replied. Keys. The word functioned like a lever. For a heartbeat, Greg weighed the cost of pushing further. He looked past Marcus toward Danielle, something like calculation sparking and dying in his eyes. He had not expected to be cornered in daylight. Slowly, with the reluctance of a person walking toward an unwelcome truth, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a compact ring of keys, the metal chiming softly as they slid free. He crossed to the custom counter and set them down beside the solstice set with a little more force than necessary. The tiny clatter felt like punctuation. Thank you, Marcus said. Stand by. He faced the staff as a group, his tone widening to include them. We're going to make this simple. For the next few minutes, your priorities are guests and calm. Nothing is wrong with you. The process is working. Darren, continue outreach. Jenna, you are point at register. Luis, hold. I will be with you shortly. He looked to Danielle again, lowering his voice just enough that the nearest customers could not hear. Would you like to see anything while I clear space? Not yet, she said. I would like to hear him. And her eyes moved to Greg, not accusing, not even demanding, simply stating a next step as unavoidable as gravity. If there had been the slightest path left for Greg to reverse course with dignity, he did not take it. I followed judgment, he said, his tone striving for level and landing hard. We do not open high-value cases for browsers. We avoid awkwardness. That is what I was doing, protecting the environment. Marcus studied him, face unreadable. Describe the guests in front of you when you made that judgment, he said. Use only observable facts. Greg blinked. He had expected support, or at least solidarity. He had not expected interrogation in situ. She was wearing sneakers, he began, as if that single item would start and finish the matter. Casual clothing. No appointment. No account that I recognized. Lingering in a restricted section. Clothing. Marcus repeated, expression neutral. Appointment. Recognition. Anything else you can observe that is not interpretation. Greg hesitated, then shook his head. That is sufficient, he said. Experience tells me who is here to buy and who is here to... Marcus lifted a hand a half-inch, enough to halt the old script before it found momentum. I did not ask what experience tells you, he said. I asked for facts. Thank you. For the first time since Marcus walked in, a small, almost imperceptible shift traveled through the staff, a loosening in shoulders, a softening in the line of the jaw. It was not joy, not yet, but it was recognition that the temperature was no longer rising unchecked. A teenage boy near the starburst pedestal watched with serious eyes, his mother's hand on his shoulder. He whispered something. She murmured back a gentle shoo, and he nodded, gaze still fixed. Across the room, a woman who had paused with a pair of earrings in her hand resumed examining them, as if normal commerce might coax the moment back toward ordinary. Marcus turned to custom counter, reached for the incident forms Jenna had slid into a neat stack, and placed one in front of Greg. Write it down, he said, exactly as you just said it. I want your words while they're still untouched by hindsight. He slid a pen across the glass. Include your rationale. Greg looked at the form as if it might bite. He did not touch the pen. You are embarrassing the store, he said, voice low and charged. In front of customers. The store embarrassed itself, Marcus replied, tone still calm. We are correcting it in front of customers. That matters. He inclined his head toward the nearest guest, a silent acknowledgement that people see more than you think when you pretend they are not looking. Danielle moved not away, but along the case line, her gaze skimming the displays with a focus that was both aesthetic and structural. She was not tallying inventory. She was reading culture in angles and spacing, in the way tags were written and how trays were squared. She stopped at the Solstice Crescent, the near circle that had started this small storm. Up close, the paved work held beautifully, each stone nested with care. She could see the hand that had done it. In another context, she might have felt only pride. Now, a different thread braided through, the knowledge that good work can live under bad leadership and be diminished by it. Ms. Carter, Marcus said, voice gentler now, would you like a seat? I would like the team to keep their rhythm, she said. I am standing. He accepted this with a nod and turned back to Greg. You will finish that statement, he said, indicating the form, and then you will step into the back. Do not leave the premises. Do not speak to staff about this. Do not touch the system. Greg's jaw moved as if he were chewing words he could not swallow. You are overreaching, he said. I have the numbers to back my approach. Conversion, average ticket, shrink. You know my metrics. And I know what those metrics do not measure, Marcus answered. They do not measure harm. They do not measure how many people did not return, because they were made small. They do not measure the moment when a brand that promises belonging makes someone feel like a trespasser. He did not raise his voice, but chord vibrated under the words. And even the air conditioning seemed to quiet to listen. Jenna returned from the printer with small paper cups of water, offering one to the watch couple, one to a woman in the navy dress, one to Danielle last. For you, ma'am, she said, not quite looking up, and Danielle accepted with a small thank you that contained more than thirst. Greg pushed the form back across the counter, without writing. I will not put something on paper that can be misinterpreted, he said. I will explain myself to human resources, not on the floor. You will do both, Marcus said. Start now. For a moment, Danielle thought Greg might refuse in full, draw a personal red line he could not defend. Instead, he picked up the pen, gripped too tight, and wrote 2 sentences in abrupt, cramped script. He set the pen down and slid the paper back, as if he could limit the record by limiting the lines. Marcus read. He did not react. He folded the sheet once, cleanly, and placed it inside a slim folder from his inner pocket. Thank you, he said, the words true and empty at once. Back room. Now. Greg glanced around the store one last time, searching faces for a loyalty he had not earned. He found none willing to meet his eyes. He gave a brittle, professional smile to no one in particular and walked toward the rear hallway, the measured cadence of his steps undercut by a stiffness in his shoulders that read as fear if you knew how to read it. As the door to the back swung closed behind him, a small exhale passed through the staff, not coordinated but collective. Darren refilled a water glass. Jenna straightened a stack of velvet pads that did not need straightening. Luis lifted his hands again, as if asking silently whether it was safe to return to his work. Marcus answered with a small nod, and the room resumed its heartbeat. For the first time since re-entering the store, Danielle addressed the nearest customers directly. "Thank you for your patience," she said, voice carrying just enough to be heard without feeling like an announcement. "We will not let your afternoon be defined by this." The promise landed like a hand placed lightly on a shoulder, steadying. A woman near the studs met Danielle's eyes and said very quietly, "Good," and then looked down, letting the moment release. Marcus stepped to Danielle's side again. "We can continue here," he said, "or we can move to the office." "Here," she answered. "Let the team see that accountability does not require secrecy." He accepted that, then glanced at the Solstice case. "Do you want to keep that locked?" "For now," she said. "Later, I will see it, but I will see it with them." Marcus absorbed the nuance without needing it explained. He turned to the staff. "Team, reset to your stations. If you are with a guest, continue. If you are free, your job is to make sure every person in this room knows they are welcome. No exceptions. We will debrief after close." The team dispersed, not hurried, not sluggish, finding the rhythm again. Marcus faced Danielle, lowering his voice. "I will be direct," he said. "What do you need from me in the next few minutes?" "Hold the frame," she said. "Let him try to justify himself once more, in a room that will not applaud him." "You will speak?" he asked. "When it is time," she said. They stood in a companionship born not of routine, but of shared fidelity to the same promise. The minutes ahead were already taking shape. The explanation that would not hold, the decision that would. For now, Danielle let her eyes move once more over the room she had imagined years ago and built with discipline. Seeing the way light made a field of small fires on the diamonds and how those sparks drew people closer, not to own a thing, but to feel, if only for a moment, that the world could meet them with beauty, without first measuring whether they deserved it. She would make that true again here. The back door opened. Greg reemerged. Face carefully reset, ties smoothed, a paper-thin version of the manager he had been 20 minutes earlier. He approached with the gravity of a person who thinks he can still negotiate terms with the tide. He stopped 2 paces from Marcus and Danielle and folded his hands, a gesture borrowed from training manuals and daytime seminars. "I have reflected," he said, choosing the word like a prop. "If introductions had been offered, we would not be here." Danielle regarded him. "We are here because you believed you could read value from a glance," she said. Not cruelly, not loudly, but with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. His mouth opened, closed. He pivoted to Marcus. "I have produced results," he said. "I have protected the store. Sometimes leadership looks like hard calls people do not like. And sometimes it looks like refusing to humiliate someone to make your job feel bigger." Marcus replied, "We will finish this now." He gestured toward a spot slightly to the left, out of the main traffic floor, but still in sight. "Stand there." Greg moved as directed. The repositioning did something subtle to the theater of the moment. He was no longer centered. He was no longer the frame. The staff continued to work. Customers resumed soft conversations, and the store reclaimed its sound. Danielle felt the shift settle in her bones like a door closing softly on a room that had been out of square. The next words would determine the rest of the day, and the day after that, and the weeks of retraining that would follow. She was ready to speak when called, ready to listen when needed, ready to take the weight of a brand back into her own hands and make its promise credible again. The low murmur of the store returned in fragments, a rustle of velvet trays being repositioned, the faint clink of a bracelet clasping shut, and the subdued exchanges between staff and customers who were now pretending not to be aware of the standoff unfolding in plain sight. The air was heavier, not from tension alone, but from the collective sense that the next few minutes would define the narrative everyone would remember. Marcus took one step closer to Greg, his voice pitched so that only those within a small radius could hear, yet clear enough for nearby customers to catch fragments. "Greg," he began, "this is your opportunity to speak to Miss Carter directly. She is here. She has heard your choices explained secondhand, and now you can tell her what made you decide she did not belong on your floor." Greg's jaw shifted, the muscle at the corner twitching once before settling. He turned his gaze to Danielle, not fully meeting her eyes, but hovering near enough to feign engagement. "I acted based on what I believed was in the best interest of the store," he said, each word measured. "We have cultivated an atmosphere here that caters to a certain clientele, and it's my job to maintain that standard." Danielle held his gaze without flinching. "And in maintaining that standard," she said evenly, "you decided I was not a fit before knowing my name, my purpose, or my reason for walking into the store." His shoulders rose with a slow inhale. "It wasn't about you personally," he replied. "It was about reading the cues that tell me who is ready to buy and who is not." She let a short silence fill the space, not rushing to respond. "Those cues," she said finally, "came from what you saw, not for what you heard me say, not from any questions I asked. You replaced curiosity with certainty before giving me the courtesy of one honest interaction." A faint shift ran through the room. Darren, the associate who had been engaging customers with water and quiet reassurances, glanced over from the watch case. Jenna, behind the register, froze mid-motion with a jewelry box in hand. Even the customers nearest the display appeared to lean fractionally toward the exchange, as if the weight of Danielle's words carried an invisible pull. Greg's lips pressed into a thin line. "I use my experience," he said. "Years of knowing which conversations end in a sale and which ones don't. I don't apologize for protecting the efficiency of my team." Marcus spoke then, his tone precise. "Efficiency without respect is not efficiency. It's erosion. It eats at the culture until there's nothing left worth protecting." Greg's eyes flicked toward him but returned to Danielle. "Maybe I misread the situation," he said, though the words lacked conviction. "You didn't misread," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You saw exactly what you wanted to see. That's the problem." For the first time, he looked directly at her. The contact was brief, almost offensive, but it was there. "And if I had known who you were," he asked. Danielle did not hesitate. "Then you would have treated me differently, and that would still mean you failed. Because every person who walks into the store deserves the standard you reserve for important customers. My name shouldn't be the trigger for basic respect." The statement landed without theatrics, but its clarity made the moment undeniable. A man near the earring display adjusted his stance, his eyes narrowing slightly as though reassessing everything he had observed in the last half hour. Greg's expression wavered. "I built numbers here," he said, almost as if reminding himself. "Sales, client retention, event conversions." Marcus cut in a single-hand motion, halting him. "Numbers matter, but the brand matters more. You don't get to keep the first by sacrificing the second." He let the words rest a beat before adding, "Especially not when the person standing in front of you built the very thing you're claiming to protect." Greg's head turned slightly, his gaze darting toward the Solstice case and then away again, as though the necklace were a silent witness he didn't want to face. Danielle stepped closer, closing the space between them by half. "I built this company with the belief that every person who steps inside should feel seen, not scanned for a price tag in the first 3 seconds. That belief is in our training materials, in our hiring process, in the way we lay out our stores. What I experienced here was the opposite. It wasn't just unprofessional. It was a violation of the very foundation you're paid to uphold." Her words were measured, but the authority beneath them was impossible to miss. Greg's chin dipped almost imperceptibly, his eyes dropping for a fraction of a second before he caught himself. Jenna, still behind the register, shifted her weight. Danielle caught the flicker of something in her expression. Relief, maybe, or the recognition that this conversation was about more than one confrontation. The quiet that followed was deep enough for the faint clinking of a bracelet being laid onto velvet to sound loud in comparison. Danielle didn't feel it. She let the absence of noise underscore the fact that the floor, both literal and figurative, now belonged to her. Marcus, reading the moment, gave a short nod. "Greg," he said, "anything else you want to add before I make the next call?" Greg's mouth opened, closed. His hands clasped loosely in front of him, a gesture that was neither contrition nor defiance, simply stalling. "No," he said finally. Marcus's response was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Then we'll proceed." He turned slightly toward Danielle, a silent acknowledgement that her presence was the axis around which the rest of the afternoon would turn. She didn't need to signal agreement. Her expression said enough. The unmasking was complete. The question of who held authority here no longer needed to be asked. All that remained was what would be done with it, and she intended to see that through without leaving a single doubt in the minds of anyone who had witnessed this from start to finish. Greg's throat worked once before any sound emerged. The silence stretched so long that it seemed he might choose to keep it. But when he finally spoke, his words landed with a heavy drag of someone stalling for footing. "Look, I didn't know who you were," he began. His voice quieter than before, but still edged with a trace of self-justification. "If I had known, things would have gone differently." Danielle's gaze didn't shift. "You're right," she said, her tone as precise as the cut of a diamond. "They would have, but that's exactly the point." He exhaled, trying to turn her words into an opening. "That's not what I meant. I thought—" She cut in, not with volume, but with clarity that sliced straight through his half-formed excuse. "You thought I didn't belong here. You thought you could tell, in an instant, that I wasn't worth the time or the product. And because you were so certain of that, you never bothered to ask my name, never asked what brought me here. You replaced the fact with your assumptions and called it professionalism." A muscle jumped at his cheek. He glanced toward Marcus, perhaps hoping for intervention, but Marcus only watched, expression neutral, giving no lifeline. Greg cleared his throat. "In this job, you develop instincts. I use those instincts to avoid wasting time." "Instincts," Danielle repeated, her voice still low, but carrying across the space. "That's an elegant word for bias when you don't want to name it. You didn't avoid wasting time. You waste an opportunity, not just make a sale, but to do your job without diminishing someone in the process." The customers nearest the exchange pretended to browse, but the stillness of their hands on the displays betrayed their focus. Jenna, at the register, no longer tried to disguise that she was listening. She stood with her fingers resting on the edge of the counter, her eyes fixed forward. Greg's defense shifted tack. "This store has a reputation," he said. "We have to protect it. I was making sure the environment stayed consistent for our regulars." Danielle tilted her head slightly, as though studying a piece of jewelry under better light. "Consistent for whom?" she asked. "For the people who look a certain way, dress a certain way, speak a certain way? Because if your version of protecting the store means closing it off to the very people we claim to welcome, then you've misunderstood the entire foundation of our brand." His lips pressed in. "It's not about appearance. It's about reading the signals that matter." "And what signals did I give you?" she asked. "Be specific." He hesitated, his voice catching on the first syllable. You didn't make direct contact with staff when you came in. You lingered in a high-value section without asking for help right away. You seemed," he trailed off, clearly aware that his list was flimsy in the face of scrutiny. "Seemed," Danielle echoed, another word for guessing. "I did not speak to anyone immediately, because I wanted to observe. I lingered because I was interested. Those are not signs of a problem, unless you decided they are when certain people do them." Greg shifted his stance, as though the carpet beneath him had grown unsteady. His voice grew sharper, a last-ditch attempt to reclaim control. "I've been running this location for years without issues. My team knows I keep things running smoothly. My numbers—" Marcus stepped in, cutting him off with a quiet firmness. "Your numbers will not save you from the culture you created. What happened here today is not an isolated mistake. It's the result of patterns. You might not see them because you've learned to call them something else, efficiency, instinct, standards, but they are patterns all the same, and patterns have consequences." Greg's eyes flickered between them, his shoulders drawing tighter. So what? I lose my job because of one misunderstanding. Danielle didn't hesitate. You lose your job because of a decision you made with absolute certainty and without an ounce of curiosity. You lose it because you chose exclusion over engagement, because you decided my worth before hearing a single word from me. And if you did it to me, you've done it to others. The difference is that today, the person you pushed out is the one who signs your paycheck. The words landed with quiet force. No one moved for a full 2 seconds. Even the faint hum of the air system seemed louder in the absence of speech. Greg swallowed hard. His next words came out brittle. I was doing what I thought was right for Store. You were doing what was easiest for you. Danielle corrected. They're not the same thing. Marcus let the silence stand for a beat before speaking. Greg, go to the back. Gather your belongings. When you're done, leave your keys with me. Greg's jaw worked as if he might argue again, but the room had already shifted beyond his control. The staff's attention was no longer divided. It was fixed. The customers nearby didn't bother pretending to be absorbed in merchandise anymore. The authority in Marcus's voice, coupled with the unshakable calm in Danielle's, left him nowhere to land. Without another word, he turned toward the rear hallway. His steps were measured, but his shoulders were rigid, and the sound of the back door swinging shut was louder than it needed to be. Danielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, not from relief, but from the finality of a decision that was now past the point of reversal. She scanned the faces of the staff, not to gauge loyalty, but to read whether they understood what had just happened. In most, she saw it. The recognition that the standard had just been reset in real time. Marcus stepped closer. He'll be gone in 5 minutes, he said quietly. Good, she replied. But that's not where this ends. Her tone made it clear. This moment wasn't just about removing one manager. It was about repairing something deeper. The invisible fracture that had been allowed to grow in a space meant to embody welcome. And she intended to make sure every person in that room, employee and customer alike, would leave knowing that fracture was already being sealed. The muffled sound of a latch closing echoed faintly from the back hallway, followed by the dull thud of a locker door. The noise carried just enough to remind everyone that the moment was still unfolding, even if Greg was no longer in sight. The store returned to a quieter rhythm, but the energy in the air was still taut, like a string that had been pulled too tight and was waiting to be cut. Marcus remained near the custom counter, folder in hand, his posture one of controlled readiness. He wasn't leaning, wasn't relaxed. His stance was deliberate, like someone expecting one more move before the game ended. Danielle stood a pace beside him, scanning the store without breaking her calm. The customers, while still engaged with displays, were no longer pretending they weren't aware of what was happening. They simply watched from the corners of their eyes, understanding that they were in the middle of an unplanned, unscripted shift in authority. The back door opened again. Greg emerged carrying a slim black bag in one hand, his suit jacket folded over the other arm. His expression was a careful mask, neither defiant nor apologetic, just the face of someone determined to leave without further loss of dignity. He walked forward, each step deliberate, the sound of his soles muted against the carpet, but still measured enough to be noticed. Marcus didn't move until Greg reached the counter. Then, with a motion that was both formal and final, he extended his hand, palm open. Keys. Greg set the ring of keys in Marcus's hand, the metal cold against the supervisor's skin. There was no flourish, no hesitation, just a simple exchange that carried the weight of an ending. Marcus closed his fingers around them and placed them into the folder with the incident form. Your access ends now, Marcus said, his tone firm but even. Human Resources will contact you tomorrow morning to finalize paperwork. You are not to return to this location for any reason. Greg's gaze shifted to Danielle for the briefest moment, but whatever words had been forming stayed unspoken. Instead, he gave a short nod to Marcus and turned toward the door. Danielle's voice stopped him before he reached it. One thing. He turned halfway, his face tight but still composed. Yes. She didn't raise her tone, but the precision in her words left no room for misunderstanding. Every person who walks through those doors is a potential client, an ambassador for this brand, or both. You chose to see me as neither before you knew a single thing about me. That choice has cost you more than this job. It has cost you the credibility that comes from treating people with respect before they've earned it in your eyes." Greg absorbed the statement without reply. His jaw tightened once, and then he turned fully, pushing the door open and stepping into the sunlight. The glass slid shut behind him. The softness of the door almost anticlimactic compared to what had just passed. For a moment, the store was utterly still. Then Marcus exhaled slowly, setting the folder on the counter and letting his shoulders ease just slightly. He glanced at Danielle. "It's done." Danielle nodded, but her gaze had already shifted to the staff. She wasn't looking for sympathy or validation. She was checking the room for understanding. Her eyes moved from Jenna at the register to Darren by the watches to Luis at the bench. "You just saw an example of what happens when someone in a position of trust fails to uphold the core values of this company," she said, speaking clearly enough for every corner of the store to hear. "That's not drama. That's accountability." The staff remained attentive, some nodding subtly. A woman near the earring display, still holding a pair of studs, looked from Danielle to Marcus with an expression that was part admiration, part relief. Danielle continued. Radiance was built on more than craftsmanship and quality. It was built on making people feel valued the moment they arrive. No one earns that value. They have it already. We either honor it or we don't. And if we don't, we've already lost more than a sale. Her words were deliberate, but they didn't come across as a speech. They landed more like an invitation or a challenge to everyone listening to decide what kind of environment they wanted to work in and represent. Marcus waited until she finished before stepping forward again. "Team, I'll meet with each of you over the next few days," he said, "privately and in person. I want your perspective on how we can reinforce our standards so that what happened today never repeats itself." Darren spoke up first, his voice cautious but steady. "We've seen things before. Not like this exactly, but moments where it didn't feel right. We didn't know if we could say anything without making it worse." "You can," Danielle said, answering before Marcus could. "And you should. If you speak up and it's ignored, that's a leadership failure. If you don't speak up, that's a team failure. Neither is acceptable here." The words hung there, not accusatory, but charged with expectation. Jenna straightened at the register, as if the statement had struck something she'd been carrying. Danielle shifted her attention to the customers who had quietly been part of the audience. "I want to thank you for your patience this afternoon," she said. "This isn't the kind of moment anyone plans for, but it's one that matters. You came here to experience beauty and care. You should always leave knowing that both are still intact." A few of them smiled faintly. Others gave small nods. The woman with the navy dress lifted her glass of water slightly, as though toasting the sentiment, before returning it to the counter. Marcus stepped in beside Danielle again. "We'll take it from here," he said, his voice pitched low enough for only her to hear. "I'm staying a little longer," she replied. "I want the last impression of this visit to be the store doing what it does best, not what they just witnessed." Marcus's mouth curved in a quick, approving nod. "Then I'll make sure you have the space to do that." He moved toward the back, folder in hand, while Danielle turned back to the displays. The incident was over, but her work in the room was not. There was still a standard to rebuild, and she would start by making sure every person still inside left with a story worth telling for the right reasons. Danielle remained near the center of the store, the solstice case to her left, the main aisle stretching out ahead of her. Without Greg's looming presence, the atmosphere had begun to shift, but there was still a faint residue of tension, a kind of static that lingered in the posture of the staff and the way some customers hesitated before touching a display. She knew that if she walked out now, the day's events would leave an aftertaste, one that could either become a warning or a lesson. She intended to make it the latter. She stepped forward into the open space near the entrance, where her voice could carry evenly across the showroom without needing to be raised. The light from the tall windows caught the fine weave of her blazer and softened the edges of her silhouette. She let her gaze travel across the room, making brief eye contact with employees and customers alike. When she spoke, her tone was not defensive, nor was it triumphant. It was simply anchored. "This company," she began, "exists for a reason beyond selling jewelry. We create pieces that celebrate moments, engagements, anniversaries, personal victories, quiet achievements no one else may ever see. But none of that matters if the moment someone walks through these doors, they're made to feel small, judged, or unwelcome. The words settled into the stillness like stones dropped into calm water. Jenna straightened behind the register. Darren paused mid-conversation with a young couple at the watch display. Even Luis, who had resumed his work at the bench, lifted his head slightly to listen. Danielle continued, her voice steady. Our commitment is not just to the craft, but to the person standing in front of us. That commitment doesn't have conditions. You do not need to meet a dress code to be treated with respect. You do not need to explain your finances to be shown our best work. You do not need to prove your worth to deserve kindness here. A woman holding a delicate gold chain glanced at her partner and gave a small nod, as if the words had confirmed something unspoken. Danielle shifted her stance, letting her hands rest lightly in front of her. When someone enters a Radiant store, they belong here until they decide to leave. It's that simple. And if anyone on this team ever forgets that, we will correct it immediately. She let the sentence breathe before adding, what happened today was not just about me. It was about the risk we take when we let assumptions replace service, when we choose efficiency over empathy, when we confuse protecting the brand with guarding the door against the wrong people, as if such a thing even exists. There was no applause, but the change in the room was palpable. The customers who'd been frozen in quiet observation began to move again, not with the cautious steps of people tiptoeing around conflict, but with the natural flow of shoppers returning to their own purposes. Danielle turned her attention to the staff. You are not here to be gatekeepers. You are here to be guides. You are here to listen, to learn, and to help someone find what speaks to them. That's not just good business. That's the foundation of trust. And trust is what keeps people coming back, telling their friends, and wearing our pieces not just with pride, but with a memory of how they were treated when they chose them. Jenna's shoulders loosened, her hands no longer clinging to the counter. Darren gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile to the couple beside him. Luis looked down at the ring he'd been repairing, then back up, as if seeing his work with new relevance. Danielle glanced toward the customers again. To those of you here today, I want to thank you for witnessing this moment. It would have been easier to handle it behind closed doors. But I believe the way we respond to mistakes is just as important as the mistakes themselves. If we hide accountability, we teach the wrong lesson. If we face it openly, we set the right standard. She stepped back slightly, signaling that she was done addressing the room. There was no forced ending, no grand gesture, just a quiet closing of the statement that would leave its mark. A man near the earring display was the first to break the moment. That's how it should be, he said softly, almost to himself, but loud enough that a few heads turned. His partner squeezed his arm in agreement. Danielle gave him a small nod of acknowledgement before moving toward the nearest display, inviting the space to return to normal without abruptness. She began asking the staff about certain pieces, prompting Jenna to bring out a tray of rings and Darren to describe the craftsmanship on a limited bracelet. The shift was intentional. She wanted the team to see her as engaged, approachable, and invested, even in the wake of a public confrontation. For the next several minutes, she moved from case to case, speaking with customers as naturally as if she had been on the floor every day. She complimented a young woman's choice of a pendant, asked a man about the occasion for which he was buying a gift, and took a moment to admire a custom engagement ring design a couple had commissioned. Her presence was no longer the still scent of a storm. It was a steady warmth of someone reminding the room why it existed in the first place. By the time Marcus returned from the back office, the tension had thinned to almost nothing. The store had reclaimed its usual rhythm, but with an undertone of something sharper, awareness. The lesson had been received, even if no one spoke it aloud. Danielle caught Marcus's eye across the room. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched for a moment as she spoke with a customer, her hand gesturing lightly toward the sparkle of a diamond under the lights. It was clear that whatever else might be discussed later in private, the immediate repair had begun here, in front of everyone, with no script and no retreat. When she finally stepped back from the case, Marcus approached. You just rewrote the tone of this place, he said quietly. I didn't rewrite it, she replied. I reminded them what it was supposed to be. He gave a short nod, the kind that said he understood the difference. The store was steady again, but the weight of what had happened would remain, not as a shadow, but as a guidepost. And that, Danielle thought, was exactly how it should be. Danielle didn't let the energy she'd just created dissipate. The room had shifted back toward a comfortable rhythm, but comfort alone wasn't enough. She wanted to anchor this new tone so deeply that it would remain long after she left. The only way to do that was to spend real time here, not as a CEO on a quick inspection, but as part of the team. She stepped toward Jenna at the register. Would you walk me to the current collection displays? She asked, the request framed as if she were any other colleague seeking insight. Jenna hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Of course. She moved from case to case, explaining the arrangement, highlighting new arrivals, and pointing out which designs have been resonating most with customers. Danielle listened closely, asking specific questions about sourcing, client reactions, and even the practicality of certain clasps. As they reached the center of the store, Danielle paused to look over the solstice necklace again. It's beautiful, she said, her tone neither approving nor critical, just honest. Who first suggested we launch this design? Jenna glanced down. It came from one of the regional designers. It was approved by Greg before the official review process. Some of us liked it, but we didn't know if it would pass final sign-off. That small admission told Danielle what she needed to know. The store hadn't just suffered from poor client treatment, but also from a breakdown in procedural trust. She made a mental note to address the chain of approvals with Marcus later. Moving toward the back of the showroom, Danielle joined Darren, who was showing a couple of selection of gold bangles. She waited until he'd finished, then asked quietly, "How's the pace here on weekends?" "It depends on the week," he replied. "When there's an event or trunk show, we're packed. But there are slower Saturdays when we rely on walk-ins. That's when the atmosphere really matters. If people don't feel welcome, they leave in seconds." She heard the emphasis on welcome and recognized it was a generic word for him. It carried the weight of what they'd all witnessed earlier. "Have you ever felt you couldn't speak up if something seemed off?" she asked. Darren looked at her for a moment, as if weighing how much honesty to risk. "Yes," he said finally. "Sometimes it felt like there was no point. If Greg made a call, that was the end of it, even if the rest of us saw it differently." Danielle gave a single nod. "That ends today. If you see something that conflicts with our values, you bring it up. If you're ignored, you keep going until you're heard. And if anyone makes you feel unsafe for speaking, you call me directly. That's not just permission, it's part of your job." Darren's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the set of his shoulders eased. "Understood," he said. Over the next half hour, Danielle moved through each section of the store, speaking to every staff member individually. With Luis, she examined a custom engagement ring in progress, asking about the timeline and the client's vision. With a newer associate named Claire, she discussed how best introduce high-value pieces to first-time customers without making them feel tested. Customers were drawn into the flow naturally. A man choosing a pendant for his wife ended up in a short conversation with Danielle about the symbolism of certain gemstones. A teenager buying a graduation gift for her sister shyly asked if Danielle thought the silver locket she'd chosen would be meaningful enough. Danielle assured her it would, and suggested a way to personalize it with a small engraving. It wasn't about making sales, though transactions continued as normal. It was about reestablishing the store as a place where people felt comfortable, even cared for. The warmth began to spread in subtle ways. More laughter between staff and customers, easier body language, the kind of small talk that felt genuine instead of obligatory. At one point, Danielle noticed a woman near the entrance looking hesitant, glancing between the displays and the door as though debating whether to stay. Danielle approached with an easy smile. "First time here?" The woman nodded. "I was just looking, wasn't sure if I should come in." "You're here now," Danielle said. "Take your time. Look at anything you like. If you have questions, we'll answer them. No pressure." The woman relaxed and eventually spent 15 minutes browsing, leaving with a modest pair of earrings and a promise to return for a necklace she'd admired. That was the kind of client experience Danielle wanted the team to see in action, not just to talk about, but to feel. When the hour she'd intended to spend turned into nearly 2, Marcus reappeared from the back office. "You've rebuilt the room," he said quietly when they stood together near the register. "It feels different in here." Danielle glanced around. "That's the point. If I'd left after the confrontation, the last thing everyone remembered would have been the conflict. Now the last thing they'll remember is connection." She turned back to Jenna. "I'm leaving soon, but before I go, I want to make sure everyone here has my direct contact. If you ever feel you can't raise something through the usual channels, you come to me, and don't wait for a crisis to reach out. Tell me about the small things, too. They matter." Jenna took the card Danielle offered, holding it with both hands. "Thank you," she said, and it sounded like more than politeness. Danielle knew trust wasn't restored in a single afternoon. It was rebuilt one interaction at a time, reinforced every day until it became unshakable. But today had been a start, and in a company built on moments, a good start was a moment worth protecting. When she finally stepped toward the door, the staff was engaged with customers, conversations flowing easily. No one was watching the exit with apprehension. The space felt whole again, and that, Danielle thought, was as important as any policy she could enforce. The sunlight outside had shifted since Danielle first stepped into the store that afternoon. The sharp, overhead glare of early day had mellowed into a warmer, angled glow, casting long shadows across the pavement. From her position near the entrance, she could see the reflection of the street in the tall glass panels. Cars sliding past in slow intervals, people crossing at the far intersection, the occasional flash of color from a shop sign across the way. Inside, the showroom's atmosphere was steady now, the earlier tension absorbed into the quiet hum of genuine interaction. The muted jazz track played on, unbroken by raised voices or sidelong glances. The staff was spread evenly across the floor, engaged in conversations that looked and felt natural. Danielle stood still for a moment longer, her eyes traveling from the solstice display to the cases of engagement rings, then to the register where Jenna was wrapping a purchase with care. Every detail was deliberate, not in the sense of perfection, but in the way the space felt aligned again. It was the same floor plan, the same light, the same merchandise, but the energy had shifted. That, she thought, was the real architecture of a store. Not the walls or the fixtures, but the culture that lived between them. Marcus approached quietly from the side, not to pull her away, but to join her view of the room. "It's holding," he said. She nodded. "It will, if they keep reinforcing it. This can't just be a good day that follows a bad one. It has to be the standard." "You've made that clear," he said. Danielle glanced toward him. "It's not about clarity. It's about consistency. If they see it carried out every day, it becomes habit. If it becomes habit, it becomes identity. That's when you know the culture is safe." They stood there another beat before she turned toward the door. She moved slowly, not as if reluctant to leave, but in a way that allowed her to take one final read of the space. Customers glanced up as she passed, and she gave each a brief but genuine acknowledgement, a nod, a small smile, a few words to those nearest the aisle. When she reached the door, she placed her hand lightly on the cool metal handle, then looked back once more. Her gaze swept the staff, Darren leaning slightly toward a customer to point out the subtle engraving on a bracelet. Luis at his bench, focused and steady. Jenna at the register, sliding a ribbon into place with unhurried precision. She didn't say anything to them now. The lesson had already been spoken, and the work had already begun. Her silence in this moment was intentional, a way of letting them own the space without her voice carrying it. Outside, the late afternoon heat was softer than the midday blaze. The air smelled faintly of roasted coffee from the cafe down the block, mingled with a clean, metallic scent of fresh rain evaporating off the asphalt from a brief passing shower. Danielle paused just beyond the doorway, the glass reflecting her image back at her. In that reflection, she saw herself framed by the store she had built from a sketchbook dream into a reality that now stretched across multiple cities. She looked composed, but there was no mistaken fatigue in her eyes. Not physical exhaustion, but the weight of a day that had required both precision and restraint. Still, beneath it, there was a thread of something else. the calm satisfaction of having reclaimed a space that could have easily slipped further from its intended purpose. A couple walking past slowed slightly, their eyes flicking from her to the store sign above. One of them gave a subtle nod, not a greeting exactly, but a quiet recognition. Danielle returned it with a faint lift of her chin and stepped away from the entrance, her pace steady as she moved toward the street. The sound of the city folded around her, the low rumble of a delivery truck shifting gears, the rhythmic clicking of a cyclist chain, the faint rise and fall of conversation from an outdoor cafe. She let the noise carry her forward without rushing, her thoughts already turning toward the work that would follow this moment. The debrief with Marcus, the check-ins with HR, the quiet but firm follow-through to ensure today's standard became tomorrow's expectation. As she reached the crosswalk, the store was still visible in her peripheral vision. The front glass caught the warm light, throwing back a golden reflection that made the display cases inside glow from a distance. The image stayed with her for a moment before the signal changed and she stepped off the curb. Her stride was sure, her head high. She wasn't walking away from the confrontation. She was walking toward the next chapter of her leadership, one in which every store in the company, no matter the city or the staff, would carry the same unshakable principle. That radiance existed to welcome, not to measure, and that no one who entered its doors should ever have to prove they belonged. By the time she reached the other side of the street, the store was just another shape in the row of buildings behind her. But the shift she had set in motion there would stay, carried by the people who had seen it, felt it, and, she hoped, would now protect it as fiercely as she did. The day had begun with her presence going unnoticed in her own store. It ended with the knowledge that her absence would be felt, not because of who she was, but because of what she had reminded them all to stand for.